Hello, everybody. Thank you for watching. So this is a recorded version of the webinar, Not So Unprecedented After All, 19th Century Pandemics. So my name is Virginia. I am the Information Services Librarian at the Belleville Public Library. And I wanted to do this session because during the COVID-19 pandemic, I've noticed a lot of similarities between what I studied and what's going on right now. So I have, in addition to my master's in library science, I have a degree in history of medicine, a master's in arts history of medicine from McGill University. And while I was there, I studied 19th century Canadian public health and the history of public health. And while you're learning about this, you really can't separate public health in the 19th century from epidemic diseases. The two are very, very closely entwined. So in the process of learning about public health, I really learned a lot about epidemics and pandemics. I wrote a thesis entitled Modernity, Professionalism in the 1886 Toronto Trunk Store Debate, in which I looked at doctors and engineers as agents of public health as it took place over the debate in Toronto in 1886 about creating a trunk sewer, so a sewer system. So yeah, I just wanted to do this session because I thought it would be interesting for other people to kind of learn about some of the stuff that I've learned about and maybe make some connections in their head about what they're learning, what they've learned here and what's going on in the world. Just a note, I do primarily focus on Canada and specifically Montreal and Quebec. This is because that's where my knowledge is. So I went to school in Montreal at McGill. And so a lot of what I focused on was in that area. And also epidemic diseases and pandemics tended to enter Canada primarily through the St. Lawrence, through immigration. So most of them really started in the 19th century coming through that route. So it made sense to look at Quebec, meaning Quebec City, and Montreal in that context. So that's why I am focusing on that. It is, in that respect, really Western centric, and I'm not really focusing too much on populations outside of Quebec and Montreal. So in case you're wondering kind of why, it's because that's where my knowledge is. Okay, so let's get started. So in looking at this, we've been hearing time and time again in the media how unprecedented this situation is, the COVID-19 pandemic. And truly it is absolutely in terms of scale. So there's 7.8 billion people in the world right now. We have never had that many people in the world ever. So obviously in that regard, yes, the amount of people that potentially can be affected by this and are being affected by this, the COVID-19 pandemic, is unprecedented. Another thing is simultaneous quarantine. So having quarantines occurring at the same time in many different jurisdictions is not really, it did happen, but not to the extent that we're seeing right now. And then also COVID-19 really does travel a lot faster than previous pandemics and epidemics, just simply because of the speed of travel today. So in the 19th century, for example, you saw it took 6 weeks to cross the Atlantic. Now you can do it in 6-7 hours on a plane. So obviously people can travel so much faster than they did in the past. So that's really, in that regard, certainly it's unprecedented. But when I was looking at this and when I was thinking about this and when I do think about it, there were kind of themes and feelings and issues that really felt familiar to me in our current time that were familiar based on what I had learned from previous education in my MA. So there is a lot of things that feel really familiar about this. So you can kind of think as we're going through this, you can kind of ask yourself the question, is our current situation as unprecedented as it's made out to be? You can decide that for yourself. So let's get started with our presentation. So today what we're going to talk about, I have some definitions. I'm going to talk to you about historical context, so theories of disease transmission in the 19th century. It's really important to understand this so that you're able to understand how epidemics were thought about at the time. And I'm going to talk about some common epidemic diseases really quick. Then I'm going to focus on 3 specific diseases: cholera, typhus, and smallpox. Typhus in 1847 and smallpox in 1885. I'm going to talk about some lasting impacts that these had, and then I'm going to kind of bring it back to our current time period. Okay, so some definitions that are important to understand. So an epidemic, it's an often sudden increase in the number of causes or cases, number of cases of a disease above what is normally expected in that population and area. An outbreak has the same definition, but typically refers to a smaller, more limited geographic area. So in a hospital or in a long-term care center, for example. A pandemic, so the classical definition of a pandemic, it's an epidemic occurring worldwide or over a very wide area, typically crossing international borders and usually affecting a large number of people. It is important to note that the WHO and the CDC use much more complex definitions today to define what constitutes a pandemic. So they include factors like population, immunity, virology, and disease severity. That's not something that is included in what I'm calling a pandemic in this presentation. Okay, so some historical context. So there's a historian, Erwin Acker-Knecht, and he came up with some kind of definitions, some theories to help explain how doctors and medical professionals understood disease transmission in the 19th century. So, and it's really difficult to take this out of the understanding of disease in the period. So you really do kind of have to understand where these doctors are coming from and able to understand what was happening. So the first one is contagionism. So this is the belief that a disease was caused by the direct passage of some chemical or physical influence from a sick person to a susceptible victim by contact or through the air. So this is a really familiar concept for us. This is how we think of disease transmission today generally. But it's actually a really old concept. So the idea of contagium animatum, that is like some kind of small animal comes from me and makes you sick. So it comes from out of my body and into yours. That dates it back to about the 16th century. But earlier ideas of contagionism date back to early Christianity. And the concept of quarantines actually came from this, and they were adopted by most Christian countries as a way to deal with epidemic diseases by the 15th century. So again, this is really familiar to us. This is how we understand disease transmission today. But it's not exactly how they understood disease transmission in the 19th century. So there's also what Acker-Knecht calls anti-contagionism. And this is the belief that a disease is caused by environmental factors like bad smells or miasmas rather than microscopic animals. So it's the filth theory of disease. People who believed this tended to be sanitarians, so they believed in sanitation. So this was most popular from the 1820s to the 1870s. And the reason they felt this way, where this came from, to them, contagionism was seen as really ancient, obsolete, and old-fashioned. This was a time in which medicine was really, there was a movement in medicine and different disciplines at the time as well towards becoming more scientific. So using the scientific method and trying to make medicine into a science rather than just guesswork, which is what it had really been up to that point. So in their estimation, the anti-contagionists' estimation, contagionism had yet to be proven. It was sort of an idea that had just sort of proliferated through the years, and to them it had never been put to the test. So what they did was they actually did self-experiments. So they tried to infect themselves. So there's a story of one doctor who swallowed cholera culture, for example, to try and give himself cholera. And it's really interesting because most of these experiments were really unsuccessful. So people weren't actually able to infect themselves. It didn't really work very well for them. So as to why, I don't really have an answer. Probably they didn't do it properly. Maybe they didn't extract the disease properly because they didn't have the science to be able to do that. They also didn't really understand. So today we understand that some diseases are waterborne, some diseases come from insects, some diseases are airborne. They didn't have those complex understandings of how disease transmission worked. So for them, contagionism simply meant direct contact from one person to another. And so they just didn't really have the science to back up contagionism because they didn't understand the nuances of it. So they had this feeling essentially that contagionism was inadequate because they saw that cases occurred without any direct influence or failed to occur when there was. So basically outbreaks could begin and they could end without causes that could be directly related to the presence or the absence of the sick. Why this might be, again, if it's waterborne, for example, it can spread through contaminated water or contaminated food. So perhaps a person isn't in direct contact with the person who is sick, but they've eaten the contaminated food and they become sick that way. Again, they didn't really have an understanding for that. So in their mind, contagionism was a really inadequate way to explain disease transmission. It's really important to note, though, that nobody was actually 100% anti-contagionist. So it was accepted that smallpox, for example, which had a vaccine, or syphilis, were contagious in nature. But to them, these weren't as threatening as more common epidemic diseases like cholera, yellow fever, plague, and typhus. And that's because they didn't lead to quarantine measures. So we hate quarantine today. They really hated it in the 19th century for all the same reasons. You know, it led to economic problems. It prevented you from having the civil liberties of traveling anywhere. People couldn't come into the city with goods. Maybe they had a hard time finding toilet paper. So things that, you know, the reasons that we hate quarantine today, they hated it back then, and they lived with it a lot more commonly than we do. So we don't really, like this is a new thing to us right now, having cities shut down and traveling being limited, but it was something that was a lot more familiar to people in the 19th century. And so diseases that were more likely to lead to that were more likely to lead to quarantine measures were seen as much more threatening. So smallpox, again, it had a vaccine, so it was easy enough to control comparative to some of the other diseases. And syphilis, again, it wasn't seen as an epidemic disease. I really like this quote by a Dr. J.A.F. Ozanam from 1835, which I think really shows you exactly the feelings of anti-contagionists. So he says, "We know a great number of authors who have written about the transmission of contagion by microscopic organisms. We will not waste time refuting those absurd hypotheses. So the concept that disease is caused by microscopic organisms is just so absurd, it's not even worth talking about," to the anti-contagionists. So I thought that was a really pertinent point. And then you have a third group. So these are the contingent contagionists. And they take a kind of a combination of the contagionist theory and the filth theories of disease. They have a really more moderate belief system theory, I guess. And they combine elements of each as needed, or as they felt it was scientific to do so. I would argue that it was most popular 1860s to 1880s when they were combining miasmatic theories with germ theory. So germs came from bad smells and filth. So the filth has germs in it, you're breathing them in, and that's how you're getting sick. Then later, well, mid to late century, you start seeing germ theory cropping up. And Louis Pasteur, so he worked, he's a really brilliant person. If you look at what all the work that he accomplished in his life, really amazing. He came up with vaccines for rabies and anthrax. And he also worked in fermentation. So in 1850, he worked on a theory that small animals like bacteria were agents in fermentation. He was looking at wine specifically. So he came up with that, and that was his theory, and worked on that and felt like he proved it. Joseph Lister in the 1860s, and fun fact, Listerine is named after him. He read Pasteur's work on fermentation, and he postulated that the same process, like bacteria, would lead to wound infection. So he worked in surgical wards, and he saw a lot of infection. And he thought maybe what Pasteur had postulated, so his theory that little bugs, bacteria, was causing, which led to fermentation, could also lead to infection. So he said that these microbes would enter wounds, and to fix the problem, he experimented with carbolic acid to sanitize surgical wounds. And when he did this, he actually saw a really marked decrease in morbidity, which is disease, and mortality, which is death. Why did he choose carbolic acid? At the time, it was being used to sanitize sewage. So if you consider that a lot of the prevailing theory was miasmatic, the belief there was that if you can take away the stink of sewage, you can take away the disease part of it. So remember, the anti-contagionists are sanitarians. They're working towards cleaning up really dirty cities. And cities were extremely dirty in the 19th century. You have masses of people moving in to these areas with infrastructure that really wasn't made for it. So you really didn't have things like adequate sewage removal and clean drinking water, and clean streets. So filth was really predominant. It was everywhere. There's stories of like dead animals on the side of the road and garbage in the streets. And in my thesis, I looked at a big problem were cesspools in people's backyards because they didn't have adequate ways to remove the sewage. So obviously cities were very dirty, very stinky. Carbolic acid was a way that they were using to get rid of the smell. And Joseph Lister, obviously very brilliant, thought maybe that's not exactly what's happening there. Let's use carbolic acid and see if we can make things clean. And the antiseptic theory of surgery was born. So these two together were really important in the beginning of germ theory. And this is when you start to see medicine really becoming more scientific. It became more of a science in this period than it had in any other time in history. Here's a picture of me with Louis Pasteur. So the 1880s really saw an explosion in microscopic detection of germs. So the gram stain technique was developed in 1884, making it easier to discover bacteria, grow bacteria and discover it. And in 1882, Robert Koch discovered the tuberculosis bacillus. And his work was so groundbreaking that he won the Nobel Prize in Medicine in 1905 for his work. But at the same time, you still had a lot of doctors that said that, okay, you found the bacteria, but there's no proof that that's what's actually causing disease. There was still a lot of questions. Correlation does not equal causation. So there was still a lot of questions that sat there unanswered. And a lot of doctors felt that just because you can see these little bacteria doesn't mean that that's what's causing the disease. So most common epidemic diseases in the 19th century. So these are diseases that can spike and lead to spread throughout an area. Cholera, typhus, yellow fever, plague, smallpox, influenza, typhoid, measles, and scarlet fever. Okay, so cholera really was the scourge of the 19th century. It was called Asiatic cholera. It was believed to be originated in India, and it's pretty horrible disease. I won't go into detail about it. If you really are curious, you can look up what it does to your body. Essentially, you become so dehydrated that your organs shut down and you die. And half of all victims who caught it died. And this is really startling. Death could occur 12 hours after symptoms. So you start showing symptoms and within a day you can die. So it's really, truly a very horrible disease to have. And your death is extremely violent. It's very, like it's not a nice thing to watch somebody die from cholera. And not nice at any period in time, but particularly at a time when we think of the Victorians as extremely prim and proper, and for them to see people expiring in such a violent way must have really made a big impact on them. It must have been seen as a really, really awful thing to die from. Which it was. It really, truly is a horrible disease, and it is endemic to certain areas in the world still today. So there were 6 major cholera pandemics, 1817 to 1823, 1826 to 1837. So this is when it reached North America. A lot of historians argue that it came through Quebec City into North America. 1841 to 1859. It's also spread into Central and South America, 1863 to 1875, 1881 to 1896, 1899 to 1823. So you can see for the majority of the 19th century, cholera was a problematic disease again and again and again. It had multiple waves throughout the entire world. It probably would have traveled a lot faster if people traveled a lot faster back then. So if you think of how quick people can travel from one continent to another today, if we had a cholera outbreak today, it would be extremely devastating. Fortunately, we do have different ways to try and treat it. At the time, they had no treatment whatsoever for it, so they didn't even really know, for the most part, where it came from until about the 1850s, 1860s. And even when they did, it was very difficult to control. So obviously a really bad disease and very devastating. So here's a notice from New York, 1832. And so it basically says avoid raw fruit and vegetables. And this does make sense because the raw fruit, not so much, but the raw vegetables, if you're eating, so cholera is a waterborne disease. It comes from contaminated water. You catch it from drinking contaminated water or eating contaminated food that has been in contact with contaminated water or in contact with somebody that has cholera. So raw vegetables make sense if they've been irrigated with contaminated water or touched by somebody and not cooked. And then the other things here you'll see, it comes from the idea that you don't want to weaken your body in any way. So make sure you stay warm, don't sleep in a draft, avoid getting wet. These are all ways to kind of keep your body strong and healthy so you don't succumb to it. So how did different cities deal with cholera? So I have some things here, but keep in mind that because this was throughout the 19th century, throughout the entire world, you have different jurisdictions that really are going to use different methods at different time periods. So in Europe, you saw the cordon sanitaire. So that was lockdowns of areas with military patrols to prevent anyone from coming or going, which must have been quite scary. So imagine if we were kept in our homes by military personnel. You have quarantine, fumigation, disinfection, and isolation. So disinfection would have been trying to clean up unclean areas. So remember, the miasmas are causing disease. So if we clean up dirty areas, we can prevent disease. And it's interesting if you get a chance to look up the Great Stink of 1848 in London. There was a belief that cholera in 1848 was caused by the Thames River. It was a really hot summer, and the River Thames was so polluted and stinky. The belief was that the smell that was coming out of the river was making everybody get cholera, and that's where the epidemic came from. So yeah, cleaning up unclean areas, isolation, so staying in your home, not allowed to come out, and fumigation, using things like carbolic acid to clean places up. So cholera and revolution. So an interesting theory that comes up, and Richard Evans has written an article about this, historian Richard Evans. So the argument here is that revolutions tended to coincide with cholera outbreaks. So the 1832 epidemic in England coincides with the British Great Reform Bill. And this isn't Europe, but Jeffrey Bilson has a book called A Darkened House, in which he writes about the 1837 rebellion in Canada, and his argument is essentially the cholera outbreaks pre-1837 had a significant impact in leading to the rebellion in Canada. 1848, if you know your European history, you know that 1848 is the revolution year. It was also a very serious cholera year in Europe, so it saw one of the greatest death tolls in Europe of the 19th century for cholera. And you saw Sicily, France, Germany, Italy, Austrian Empire all having cholera and all having revolutions in that year. 1866, German Confederation was overthrown. 1871 is the Second Empire in France, and 1892 is Russian-Poland disturbances, all coinciding with cholera epidemics. So why could this happen? Why would this happen? So a few reasons. Military cordons prevented people from escaping the epidemic. So flows of goods and produce were limited or prevented. You saw reduced or cut off of supplies of food and essential goods to urban populations. I think we can relate to that. Victims were isolated, so many were taken out of their homes when they were sick and put into cholera sheds where they died. If you can kind of think of this, first of all, a cholera shed is exactly how it sounds. It's not a nice place to be taken to. And if you imagine your loved ones just being forcibly removed from your home and taken to this place where you never saw them again, and it's not like you could go visit them when they were there. So they were just taken from your home and you never saw them again. So that would be pretty scary and pretty devastating for you. Medical officials were under attack because they implemented the measures that were put in place. So people didn't like what was being put in place, so they were mad at medical officials. Another really important thing is customs of burial and mourning were interrupted. So again, bodies were ordered to be disposed of rapidly to prevent the spread of disease. And this in a time when burial customs and religious last rites were really important. These things were interrupted by the measures put in place by officials, and this would lead you to not being able to give your loved one the proper send-off into heaven. So that would be extremely devastating to you, especially if you had the belief that if they didn't receive their last rites, they were going to go to hell. You can understand that this would be a really upsetting thing for families and for people. And then a lack of understanding and effective treatment for the medical community understandably left many disillusioned and distrustful in medicine. So there's accounts of doctors trying to deal with cholera and attempting to make it as scientific as they can. But when you read it, it's all guesswork. Like they really don't know exactly what they're working with. So if you read the accounts, it'll be something like Dr. So-and-so said they treated 5 people with mercury and 3 survived. So therefore, mercury is an acceptable treatment, which, by the way, was a very ubiquitous treatment in the 19th century. It was very common for people to have mercury poisoning because they were treated so many times for different ailments with mercury. Sorry, I just had to get a glass of water there. And so, yeah, a lot of these things were really guesswork on the case of the doctors, and other things like, the patient was not given any liquids and they survived, which, if that was true, is pretty startling because we know that cholera leads to dehydration, so not giving any liquids would be a bad thing to do. The opposite of probably what you want to do. Other things like, they fed them beef tea, which would be like a bone broth or a beef broth. Different sort of kept them warm, wrapped them up in blankets really tight, and that helped them recover. But really not scientific in the way that we would think of it now. Definitely not like any kind of trial where they did X number of people with such and such a treatment and X number of people with this kind of treatment. It was really like they were doing the best they could. They really didn't have the knowledge to do anything better, but they really also weren't effective in treating the disease. So you can understand that people really felt disillusioned and distrustful of the medical community. So basically, your family is removed from your home and you never see them again. They remove from your home alive and you never see them again, or they come and try to treat your family member and the person perishes anyway, or the person dies in your home and officials come and take the body and you don't get to have your priest or minister come in and provide last rites. And also you don't get any of the foods that you need or any fresh produce or anything. So you can see that, I mean, we can maybe relate to some of these things right now, and you can see that it would be understanding, I think you can be understanding that this was a pretty difficult situation for them. Another thing was that cholera was very, very heavily associated with class. So the people who predominantly contracted cholera were workers, day laborers, paupers, beggars, artisans, peasant farmers, dock workers, sailors, boatmen, fishermen, domestics, washing and cleaning people, innkeepers. The reason that would be, again, cholera is waterborne. So working on or in the water, cleaning toilets, preparing food, crowded housing, and inadequate sewage disposal would lead to the likelihood of contracting cholera. If you are a person living in poverty, you're probably going to have crowded housing and inadequate sewage disposal. So because of this, this really tended to increase class tension between upper and lower classes. So the upper classes blamed the lower classes for spreading the disease. The lower classes blamed the upper classes because they didn't have the opportunity for advancement. And they were coming in and doing all the things that we saw on this slide. And so obviously a lot of distrust between the two groups at a time when there was a big difference between rich and poor and not really so much of a middle class. So here's Richard Evans. This is a quote that I think really sums this up. So unlike natural disasters like earthquakes or floods, epidemic diseases were often influenced in their spread and impact by social and political factors and affected different groups of people in different ways and to different degrees. Thus, they opened up the possibility, the likelihood even, of widely varying responses by different groups in society and of strongly diverging theories of where the blame for their arrival and spread in the community lay. This in turn meant that they were likely to bring out latent social tensions and to lead to conflict, violence, and even ultimately revolt and revolution. So essentially, because of all these things that were happening, even if the revolution wasn't really about a cholera outbreak, the cholera outbreak led to all the inadequacies and the inequality and the issues that were already there in your society, in your community. They became so much more obvious when cholera breaks out, and you're already mad and upset because of all the things that are being put in place against you, limiting your freedom. So it really would emphasize all the, as Evan says, latent social tensions, and make them more obvious, leading to revolt and revolution. Okay, so typhus, 1874. So if you study genealogy in Canada, you're probably pretty familiar with the 1847, excuse me, typhus 1847. So yeah, if you study genealogy, you're probably know all about this, or some of it anyway. So in 1846, the potato famine in Ireland had an extremely bad year, and it was well known that it was expected to see mass immigration in 1847. American jurisdictions knew about this, and they put restrictions in place to prevent immigrants from docking in their ports. So things like high taxation on the ships. So the ships didn't really have a choice but to come to British North America, which was Canada at the time. And the conditions on the ships, and this is a 6-week passage usually, they were deplorable, crowded, and filthy, and people inevitably got sick with typhus. So here is a picture of the Grosse Ile Irish Memorial in 1909. I'm going to apologize in advance for my French. I am not a French speaker, so if you're watching this and you do speak French and you cringe at my French accent, I apologize. So 1847, so what is typhus? So it's spread by infected lice in crowded conditions. It was often called ship fever, jail fever, and camp fever, so that tells you the kind of places that you would typically see it. Pretty devastating, so 50 to 75% of cases were fatal, and it causes severe headache, high fever, chills, rash, confusion, lethargy, stupor, muscle pain, and ultimately death. So in 1847, Montreal and Quebec City felt the brunt of mass immigration first, because the first stop into the country was at Grosse Ile. So they came into Grosse Ile, they were that was their first stop. So when they stopped at Grosse Ile in Quebec, they would be examined. Anybody who was deemed well enough could continue on to Montreal. Anybody who was sick was quarantined there. Many people were in the incubation stage and became sick on the way to Montreal or afterwards, after they left Montreal, obviously spreading the disease as they went. After Montreal, they would board steamships and travel down the St. Lawrence or up into Bytown, which was Ottawa at the time. And that's how they'd move further out to the country. So that year, it's estimated that about 100,000 immigrants sailed for British North America. 70,000 landed in Montreal, which at the time had a population of 50,000. And Toronto had a population of under 20,000, processed over 38,000 immigrants. And this was all in a single summer. So if you consider that the immigration period, the season sort of began around May-ish and went until August or September. So in that 4 or 5 months, these city populations more than doubled. So if you think about Belleville, it's, I think, 52,000. If during the summer we had an influx of 60,000 people into the city, obviously that would be very difficult infrastructure-wise to deal with. That's a lot of people in a pretty short amount of time. So in Montreal, they were obviously very quickly overwhelmed by the number of immigrants coming into Canada, into the region. So they created a Board of Health to deal with the issue. The Board of Health was originally meant to have pretty sweeping powers. So they were supposed to be able to override the decisions of competing institutions. They were supposed to be able to, or they could go into your, inspect your house, fine you, or even arrest you if you didn't follow the protocols that they put in place to clean up your area. Again, remember, this is miasmatic theories. So if you have a dirty backyard with an overflowing cesspool and the medical official comes from the Board of Health and sees that you have a dirty area, and more than likely it would be your landlord that would get the fine, and if they didn't clean it up. they could be arrested. In practice, the Board of Health's power was pretty limited because the Immigrant Committee would frequently override them. So in practice, really, the Board of Health, all they could do was go in and fine people and tell people to clean up their yards and their homes. So when people came into Montreal, those who were sick, who weren't allowed to go onwards after Montreal, they were quarantined in their sheds on the Lachine Canal. And again, their sheds, it's exactly what it sounds like. So really deplorable conditions. They were crowded. I mean, they were not meant for this 70,000 people to be coming through. They were crowded, narrow bunks lined poorly constructed sheds with no sunlight. They were located in a low-lying area that tended to flood. So, I mean, in addition to just being an unpleasant place to have to spend your time, there was fears that these pools would become cesspools full of miasma, blowing disease into the city of Montreal. So the Board of Health, to deal with this, proposed a new quarantine facility be built on the Isle de Boucherville, which is an island in the St. Lawrence off of Montreal. And the Immigrant Committee denied that proposal. So during this time, when you have the Board of Health proposing a new quarantine facility and the Immigrant Committee, who was essentially in charge of all immigration matters in the city, they denied that. There was obviously some pretty serious political disagreements between liberals and conservatives. So the Board of Health tended to be on the more liberal side. The Immigrant Committee, tended to be more on the conservative side. And these are conservative and liberal as we would understand them in the 19th century, not really as we'd understand them today. And then you'd also have people on both the left and the right kind of arguing in the public. So you'd have lots of letters to the editor, for example, in newspapers would be talking about why people agree or disagree with the building of this new quarantine facility, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So the arguments are pretty nuanced, but they're there. So on the Immigrant Committee side, they made arguments about infringing on the rights of immigrants. So another thing that the Board of Health had proposed was longer quarantine periods, saying that, they should really be quarantined for about a month so that we know that if they're getting sick, they're not going to pass it on, which is pretty prudent, actually. But the Immigrant Committee said that this would be infringing on the rights of immigrants. You are essentially putting them on an island where they can't get off. They are going to be completely reliant on the government for everything they need, including leaving this facility. And then there's also, from that comes economic arguments too. So a lot of immigrants had paid for their own passage across across the Atlantic. And the Immigrant Committee was concerned that if you create an environment in which people are becoming more dependent on the government for support, you're going to get less of these self-sufficient immigrants and more people who are more likely to become a drain on the government as they saw it. So their argument was that they wanted to be encouraging people to come into the country who were going to be productive members of society, that were going to contribute to the economy of Montreal. On the other side, you had a lot of arguments about morality. So this is the 19th century. Morality is very important to them. You see that all over the place, all kinds of arguments in this period. For all sorts of stuff. Morality was an argument for so many things. In this case, it was being used to argue for the new quarantine facility. So the Board of Health argued that the new quarantine facility would keep the the newcomers safe from cheats. So it was pretty popular to have people come down to the Lachine sheds and try to trick people out of whatever little money they had. So they'd say like, oh, I can get you set up here. Just give me, 50 cents or your last $3 or whatever, and I'll get you set up. And then they never help them. So people were getting cheated out of or lotteries were another thing, which gambling would have been a really bad, immoral activity at the time. Another thing was keeping women safe from prostitution. So there was supposed evidence of women coming into Montreal, not having a lot of options because there were women, and that's just the period that they lived in. And so they were being tricked into prostitution or lured into prostitution as a way to get out of their situation, which again was immoral and not something that would be welcome in Montreal. They also argued that they wanted to prevent the spread to the population. So by taking them out of the low-lying area near the Lachine Canal, where these miasmas were developing and forming because of flooding, they would prevent the spread to the population and to the broader population of Montreal. So Montrealers signed petitions, they attended meetings to move immigrants outside of the city, and this was important because even though the Irish were bringing it into Montreal, there were cases in every jurisdiction in Montreal. So it wasn't isolated to the Lachine sheds. It was definitely spreading to other parts of the city. And because of this, you saw merchants and visitors stopped coming to the city, which again would make it very difficult to get the goods that you needed. So fresh food, fruits and vegetables, that kind of thing. And then you also saw a lot of really interesting arguments around science. And I think this particularly is something we can relate to today. So the Emigrant Committee were anti-miasma, so they were contagionist. So they denied miasmatic spread through wind. And they rightly argued, really, that only people in direct contact were the ones that were getting sick. So they were planning to up the quarantine measures along the Lachine rather than actually moving them out of the city. Now, if you recall, the contagionist belief was seen as anti-scientific. It didn't have any proof. So the Board of Health was very anti-contagionist. They believed in the miasmas. And they argued that the cesspools gathering along the Lachine sheds would spread disease to the city on the wind. And then the medical commissioners, which I think have the most interesting argument, and at the time, it's British North America, so government structures are quite a bit different than as we'd understand them today. There was a colonial government. So the medical commissioners were appointed by the colonial government, and they believed in miasma, but they said that the prevailing winds and air currents from the rapids on the St. Lawrence made it impossible for miasmas to spread their vapors into the city. So the wind was blowing it in a different direction. They weren't blowing it into the city, so you don't have to worry about it. So this is the kind of arguments that they made on the side of science. Interesting that the Emigrant Committee was actually correct, but seen as incorrect and unscientific. And again, it really made me think of the debates today that we've seen around masks and how disease is, how COVID-19 is communicated, the communicability of it. So I did think that this was a really interesting parallel that could be made today. And the third epidemic I'm going to talk about was smallpox in 1885. So smallpox is extremely dangerous. It's very highly contagious. It has a 60% close contact attack rate and an estimated 3 out of 10 mortality rate. And even if you did recover from it, you did, you would stay scarred. You'd have scarring on your skin. And so even if you recovered, so if you think about like smallpox is like a smallpox is a big, giant, really awful chickenpox essentially. And if you consider all like little chickenpox scars that we have on our skin from having chickenpox as kids, think of a giant version of that on your skin. So it wouldn't be uncommon. Most people who recovered from smallpox had scarring left over. And this is interesting, just an interesting little tidbit that once upon a time, having a smallpox scars was actually considered attractive. It was something that you would look for in a potential spouse because it meant that that person couldn't catch smallpox again. So you can only catch it once. And then once, so forms of vaccination for smallpox have been kind of dabbled with for quite some time because it was a very devastating disease and a very horrible disease to catch. I don't recommend ever looking up images of smallpox, but if you're curious, make sure you have a strong stomach before you do, because it is a very disfiguring, very, very disfiguring disease. It's not a nice thing to catch at all. And so people obviously didn't want it. It would kill you and disfigure you. And so if you had somebody with smallpox scars, they were seen as attractive. And so they dabbled with different kinds of vaccines. And when the vaccines became a little bit more viable, usable, effective, they were typically more wealthy people could afford to get the vaccine. And so the concept of like clear skin became a beauty ideal that people would go towards. So interesting how disease can actually influence beauty ideals, which is something we don't necessarily think about today. Anyway, if you caught smallpox, a really horrible part of it is that you pretty much were contagious the whole time you had it. So I apologize if you have a weak stomach. Essentially, you get these horrible eruptions on your skin, and even when you have the scabs, it's not until they are completely healed over that you're not contagious anymore. And even the skin, the scabs that come off themselves can transmit the disease. So very, very contagious. So you can catch it from infected sheets. So yeah, again, very contagious. So a smallpox vaccine has been available since 1798, which is pretty early. First vaccine, I believe, effective vaccine, as we understand it. So it was derived from cowpox. And if you're interested in that story, it's worthwhile to look up Edward Jenner and his work in smallpox, if you don't already know it. And so since 1798, there was an effective, widely available smallpox vaccine, to the point where by 1885, it was really thought to have been eradicated. It was not a disease that people were still getting to a great extent. You might get a few cases crop up here and there, but it wasn't something, it wasn't like an epidemic disease like cholera was. It was thought to be eradicated. Now we know that it wasn't truly declared eradicated worldwide until 1980 with the smallpox eradication program with mandatory vaccinations, but in 1885, it was thought to be well controlled. Interesting to note, there was also a smallpox epidemic in San Francisco, and I believe that was 1892, but I could be wrong about that. And the problem is that they also didn't understand always, or maybe the doctors understood, but the patients didn't always understand that your vaccine wasn't always effective long-term. So you sometimes had to get a booster. And so it might spread again to people who had been vaccinated if they didn't get a booster shot. So it was an interesting thing that now we understand vaccines a lot better, but at the time, if there was outbreaks, you could see some people that were vaccinated still caught it. But for the most part, it was a pretty effective and widely available vaccine and was thought to be eradicated. So because of that, the 1885 epidemic in Montreal was really, because of that and for other reasons, it was a very preventable epidemic. So it started in February 1885. A man named George Longley, who was a train conductor from Chicago, he got off the train at Bonaventure Station, and he had red eruptions all over his skin. Now I've read other things that say that there were two men. I only saw, like, George Longley is the only one that's named, so I don't really know if there was a second one or not. The historian Michael Bliss has a really good book about this called Plague, which I would definitely recommend if you're interested in this story, because it's very, very thorough. And I can't recall whether he explains whether there was two men or not, but as the one that I know is George Longley anyway. So when he got sick, when he got off the train, he was brought to the Protestant hospital, the Montreal General, because at the time you went to the hospital that was coincided with your religion, so whether you're Protestant or Catholic. So he was brought to Montreal General. The doctor there diagnosed him with smallpox and said, "You can't come in." So he was turned away. So then on the way there, he was sent to Hotel Dieu, which was the Catholic hospital. And the story there is supposedly that when he got there, the nun said, "Why didn't you go to your own hospital?" And he said, "I did. They wouldn't let me in." And she said, "Well, you're very welcome here then," and let him in. So while he was there, unfortunately, a woman that worked in the laundry got sick and died, and she spread it to other people, and other people got sick. And very quickly, there was an obvious outbreak in the hospital. And the hospital made a very strange error. And I don't really know why they did this. I think Michael Bliss goes into it in his book. So again, definitely worth checking out. But the hospital discharged anybody who was thought to be healthy. So if you seemed like you didn't have smallpox, you were sent out into the world. And obviously that spread it throughout the city. So in that respect, they made a big error and it was preventable that way. But if vaccines were so widely available, how come it continued to spread throughout the city? Well, there's a reason for this. So the primary reason was that the French Canadians were suspicious of the vaccine. Now, if you remember, he went to the French hospital. He went to Hotel Dieu, the Catholic hospital. And because he was there, the people who worked there tended to be French, and when they went there tended to be French, and when they left, they spread it to other French people because the French Canadians were suspicious of the vaccine. So obviously the deep-rooted politics between the French and the English played a big role here. And you also have to remember that this is while the Northwest Rebellion was happening as well. So that kind of led to a lot of mistrust between the two groups. There was also, I believe it was 1884, I couldn't find an answer to completely validate this, but I believe it was 1884. There was a bad batch of vaccine, and I think, if I recall correctly, it was causing erysipelas, which is a skin infection. So people who got the vaccine were getting a skin infection, or mostly little children were getting a skin infection and getting sick from that. And so for about 3 months, there was a halt in the vaccine. So it was a well-known fact that the vaccine, there was a bad batch of the vaccine in the city. The French also associated the vaccines with British surgeons, and they were made very confused by the anti-vax movement and homeopathic advocates. So there was anti-vaccinators way back in 1885, as well as there are today, and the homeopathic advocates, homeopathic treatment sort of came about in the 19th century as a response to the treatment that doctors gave to people could be have very devastating side effects. So if you're giving mercury, for example, as a treatment, the side effects of that aren't great. So the homeopathic came out of an attempt to kind of give a treatment that wasn't going to cause as much harm. So they really confused the French Canadians. They told them that the vaccinators were trying to poison French children. They used the example of the bad batch of vaccine as proof of this. So there was some conspiracy theory there. And because of the suspicion of vaccine and the lack of vaccine in the community, it spread really easily. And it also spread because many lived in really overcrowded and unsanitary households in the poorest part of the city. So it was easily spread because of the unfortunate living conditions that they had as well. So it was kind of the perfect storm for the spread of the disease. Then there's also kind of an interesting factor as well. So religious leaders said this was sort of the hand of God. This was your punishment because the year before the winter carnival, supposedly the toboggan rides were very immoral and impure, and this was punishment for people acting improperly on the toboggan rides at the carnival. So there was also an element of this as the hand of God dealing you the blow that you deserve for being improper Christians. So here is a little poster from 1885. An anti-vax poster it's essentially saying that the doctors want to vaccinate you so they make money, basically. So how did the city deal with this? So first thing was that they isolated infected households. So you may have seen these pictures online or somewhere, the little posters that were put up that said that there's smallpox in this home, do not enter, do not leave, to let people know not to go near that place. But inevitably people didn't follow the rules. They left their home while they were still covered in smallpox marks, meaning they were still infectious. So the authorities, when they went and tried to enforce vaccination or isolation or tried to carry away the dead, they were met with resistance and violence. So the people didn't want them in their home vaccinating their children. They didn't want to be put in isolation. They didn't listen when the little signs were put on their windows and their doors. They would rip them down. So there was a lot of resistance and violence. Because of all the factors that we had talked about. And so this kind of culminated, there was little riots throughout the city, but on September 28th, there was a really bad one. And the police were called to dispatch rioters who threw stones and denounced measures taken by the Board of Health. Eventually, the epidemic died down once enough people were vaccinated and enough people had become immune. They'd either become sick and become immune to the disease or unfortunately passed away. So eventually it died down, but during the period that it was in outbreak, it was a very tumultuous time in the city. So at the same time as you have the French not trusting the English elites blamed the French for spreading the disease. Even though George Longley was an English-speaking person who came into the city and brought the disease there, they ignored that. They blamed the living situation of the French for spreading the disease, the unsanitary living conditions, ignoring again the lack of opportunity by the English elites, leading to them living in those conditions. And because of the smallpox, and because again it was seen as a disease that was thought to be eradicated, Montreal was receiving an international reputation for being a plague city. So it was dirty, it was full of disease, and people didn't want to do business with Montreal. And obviously the English elites, the business owners, had a problem with that because it would impact their businesses and the general economy. So they would blame that ultimately on the French. And we think today of Toronto as being Canada's big city. It's the city that is known internationally, but at the time that was Montreal. So in 1885, Montreal was Canada's big city. The banking was in Montreal, industry was in Montreal. Montreal was the modern imperial city of Canada. So being thought of as dirty and full of an obsolete disease, or a disease that's thought to not be an issue anymore, made it seem like a real backwater. So for the English elite that were trying to improve industry in the city, this would be a really bad thing for them. So again, they would go back and blame the French for this. And so here's an image of the smallpox. So that being said, some of the lasting impacts of epidemics and pandemics in the 19th century. So we've talked about the three big ones, cholera, or we've talked about three different ones. Cholera, the big one of the 19th century. We talked about typhus and smallpox. But in general, epidemic diseases across the West had some pretty lasting impact. So the biggest one was sanitarianism. So this was because the belief that miasma and filth led to disease. It meant that sanitation was really important. So in order to stop the spread of disease. So you saw things like sewers being built, clean drinking water, waste disposal, moving filth-producing industries out of the city. So I put tanneries here. Traditionally, tanneries were actually kept farther out of the city because they're really stinky, but in this time, if they were closer to the city, they were definitely moved out. A big one was livestock markets. So we don't really think about livestock markets in modern cities like downtown London or downtown Paris, but in the 19th century, they were still located in the middle of the city. So that meant that farmers were coming in, driving cattle and sheep and pigs right through the middle of the city, leaving filth behind. And so by moving those farther out of the city, you removed a big part of the dirt that was being tracked in, keeping it a lot cleaner. Another thing was that a lot of sewers tended to, if there were sewer systems, and most of them were not a trunk sewer system, so a large sewer system, if there was any kind of sewer outlet, it typically was outlet into the same water that people would get their drinking water from. So in this time, there was a recognition that you should get those from two different places. At least at the end of the 19th century, this came to be recognized. So you have an improvement in drinking water quality. You have an improvement in general air quality. You have an improvement in sewer systems. So 1850s, 1860s, you saw big sewer systems in London, Paris being built. And just generally a cleaner city and a cleaner, healthier city. So in that regard, even though the miasmatic theory of disease was incorrect, it really did have a big, important, lasting impact in that it made these cities safer and healthier for people to live in. Another big thing, germ theory. We would not understand medicine as a science today if it weren't for germ theory. So there was a real need, obviously, to understand why people were dying. And this led to scientific medicine, and germ theory really was the beginning of scientific medicine. In government, you saw government changes, so the creation of public health boards, so things like Board of Health, Medical Officer of Health, these were made in a response to epidemic diseases, typically. Advances in epidemiology. So Jon Snow, not from Game of Thrones, in 1854 had a famous discovery with the Broad Street pump. So he figured out that all the people who had cholera in this one neighborhood in London all drank from the same pump. And when they removed the handle from the pump so people couldn't use it anymore, the cholera died down and people weren't sick anymore. So we wouldn't have, he's considered the grandfather of epidemiology, the founding father of epidemiology, and we really wouldn't have scientific epidemiology today if it weren't for his work with cholera. So today we have the ability to model diseases. We have the ability to understand transmission rates. All of those things were born out of the original kind of ideas and work that Jon Snow was building in 1850s. And then we have revolution. So republicanism, liberal ideas rose to prominence in this time, and it was really due to obvious inequality and that becoming obvious through disproportionate rates of disease in the poor. But movements towards representation in government and all those things really became more obvious and more important when you saw disproportionate numbers of people dying from a disease. So if we bring that back to today, what are some connections that we can kind of see and make? So today we've seen a big discourse in the medical community about disease transmission, rates of projection, prevention. And we know that in the 19th century, there was obviously a lot of conversation about where disease is coming from. So at the time, in the 19th century, people didn't have the science to understand how people got sick from illnesses. Today, we're dealing with a novel disease that we just, again, don't understand. So we're learning as we go about the disease. And so you'll see there's a lot of debate, there's a lot of discourse in the medical community about, are masks important? I think we've decided that they are, but there was a time there when it was a debate. And it's because it's a case of scrambling to try and understand the science, which is really familiar in the 19th century. We've also seen a mistrust of the medical profession and politicians and conspiracy theories. That's really evident 1885 in the smallpox epidemic. We had conspiracy theories, the belief that the English were trying to kill the French, which they were just trying to vaccinate them against smallpox, but it was very confusing for them. And again, a mistrust of the medical profession and politicians. We see that today, and that was really across all of the epidemics that we talked about today. I think that was really evident. In that case, again, it's because the politicians and the medical professionals are really trying to understand what they're working with. And that is the case today as well. We have a novel disease that we're still trying to completely understand. Discourse around class inequality, rates of infection, demonstrations against social distancing protocols and economic consequences, and race riots and protests. Cholera, smallpox, all saw, so smallpox, we definitely saw riots, but also big discussions about class inequality and how they relate to rates of infection were key in all of the epidemics that we talked about today. Discourses in politics about economy versus safety. So what's more important, the long-term impact that shutdowns have on the economy versus the safety of the people. Quarantines, traditionally, this has been the conversation around quarantines. This is not a new discussion. This is something that dates back to quarantines, as long as quarantines have been around. And then something I really do think is very unprecedented today, simply because of the time that we live in with technological advances. So we've seen, obviously, medical advances in the 19th century. The 19th century truly was a time of vast technological change. You went from, you saw in that period, you saw, steam being implemented. You saw, beginnings of machinery and all kinds of really amazing technological advances in the period. Today, we've seen medical advances in trying to understand COVID-19 and through really unprecedented levels of international cooperation of medical professionals. So because it is so easy to communicate internationally today, you can have a real-time conversation with somebody in China if you're in the US or Canada. And if you think about the 19th century, that just is not possible. Obviously, it took 6 weeks to send a letter across the Atlantic, so it's pretty hard to have a quick discourse. I mean, it did happen. There was obviously, you know, Joseph Lister read Louis Pasteur's paper, and their science built on each other, but not at the rapid rate that we're seeing today. So they were a decade apart. Today, the same kind of collaboration or idea sharing happens, but it can be instantaneous. So you can have researchers collaborating in China with researchers in British Columbia, for example, and they do it in the blink of an eye, immediately in real time. So that, I think, is really powerful and really interesting part of today, and something that for sure we have never seen in the past. So whether you believe COVID-19 pandemic is unprecedented or not, you can decide for yourself, but now you kind of hopefully understand a little bit more about the ways that history is sort of repeating itself, and the ways that maybe human beings can understand a crisis like this are not so unfamiliar anymore. Okay, so I have some recommended reading here. These are not necessarily books that I read for this this particular presentation, but they are books that I've read in the past that I really enjoyed, that I thought other people might enjoy. So unfortunately, because we don't currently have interlibrary loan, we don't have them at the library collection. They tended to be a little bit more on the academic side, but when we do have an interlibrary loan up and running again, I'm quite confident you'll be able to find a copy of these. A few of them are available in ebook for purchase. So Nancy Tomes, Jamie Benedictson, and Jeffrey Bilson are for sure all available in ebook that you can purchase. The only one you might have a hard time finding is the Michael Bliss book, but I'm pretty certain you will be able to find that book in public libraries. Okay, so that's it for today. I hope you enjoyed this talk. I know it's quite long, but hopefully you learned something, and you can always leave a comment and tell us what you think. All right, thanks for watching and have a great day. Thanks, bye.